Morning, everybody. My name is Mark Vina of Moor Insights and Strategy, and welcome to the SmartTechCheck podcast, where we cover all tech topics that are smart home, home automation, home security, and console gaming related. Today is Tuesday, June 30th, 2020. I hope all of you have had a great weekend and are looking forward to a super July 4th holiday. All of us certainly need a relaxing weekend with friends and family. The focus of today's podcast is a technology ingredient topic, and that's the subject of touch in technology solutions. For what I'm sure will be a lively discussion, I've got two gentlemen from the company that is arguably the de facto leader in human interface, and that is Synaptics, who is based in San Jose, California, and was founded way back in 1986. Chances are you're using a smartphone, laptop, or a host of other popular products that utilizes Synaptics technology. Today, we're going to talk about a relatively new touch capability subject, and that's the technology of force, something that has the real potential of injecting more innovation in the laptop space as well as other product categories. For a really robust discussion on this topic, I'm pleased to introduce Steve Schultis, Vice President and General Manager of Synaptics PC Division, and Tyson Mikuni, a Senior Product Manager who works at the company as well. Steve, Tyson, welcome to both of you and welcome to today's podcast. How are each of you today?
Oh, doing great, Mark. Thank you, and good morning to you and your viewers.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
And I think you're in different locations. Tyson, whereabouts are you? We'll start with you.
I'm in headquarters in San Jose.
Oh, so you're not away from me. That's right, correct. I forget that you're now back in the San Jose area. And Steve, you're in Austin during the lockdown.
That's correct.
Hunkered down there.
Coming to you from Austin, Texas, correct.
Which is a lovely place to be, and I know that firsthand. Let's talk a bit, Steve, about first and foremost, the legacy of Synaptics. I think that's a real important topic. It's one of those ingredient companies. Of course, just in full disclosure, I worked with both of you guys when I worked at Synaptics many years ago. But we know each other quite well, and I'm delighted to get you on today's podcast because this is an important topic. But Synaptics is one of those companies that not a lot of people know about, from at least a consumer level. I mean, sure, if you're, a notebook user, you might be familiar with Synaptics touchpads, but what qualifies them from a heritage standpoint, from a usage model standpoint? Let's talk a little bit about that, Steve. Let's start off with that.
Sure. Yeah, I think, if you look back at Synaptics, our first product as a company was in the touch space, right? It's the touchpad. And mid-90s, we had touchpad, scroll wheels. And so we started off kind of revolutionizing how people interact with their devices, right? People back in the old days were still using scroll mice on their PCs, and that was my very first one. And not long after that, the touchpads came out, and so it gives us a real focus on how the user interacts with the device. And I think that's one of the strongest things in the heritage of Synaptics is that the user experience is always first and foremost about how people interact with the device. And so that's one of the key areas that when we look about how do we do things forward, we're building on that legacy of understanding how do people naturally, intuitively work with a device where there's not a big learning curve.
Well, and you mentioned the magic product that really put Synaptics on the map after that initial touchpad implementation that they did with Apple during the mid-90s. But Synaptics was also responsible for developing the I wouldn't say infamous because that has a negative connotation, but the famous scroll wheel on the original Apple iPod. Not too many people know about that.
Yeah, so we worked with a number of companies to come up with devices that were implemented in a scroll wheel type format. So as the audio, personal audio devices back then were rolling out, that was a new way of interacting, right? Much different than just pressing buttons, gave people more. So those were definitely some key things that Synaptics did in the early stages.
Well, and it was impressive because at that time, MP3 players were not brand new. But what was brand new is the fact that you could, literally store, tens of thousands of songs, and that scroll wheel allowed people to scroll through those songs and be able to navigate thousands of titles, very, very quickly. And that was not something that's really possible when you have a physical implementation. So that indeed was a big deal. let's talk about, and I want to tee this up for Tyson. Force is kind of a relatively new technology topic, not just in laptops, but in technology products per se. What is force, Tyson? And let's describe that to the audience. And there'll be an animation playing that kind of describes that. But at a layman's level, what does force do, and and what's so magical about that in terms of what the innovation that might bring to the notebook space and other product spaces?
Yeah, it brings a new level of input to input devices. Most people are usually used to navigating on certain devices using X and Y coordinates, so moving up and down. But what force actually provides you is the Z, the depth, the pressure sensing, and that brings a whole new level of interaction between you and the device.
Mm-hmm. Now, Z height, which is a code for thickness, to a mainstream person who may not be completely familiar with industrial design. Let's talk about that a bit, and maybe I'll tee that up for you, because that is really important, because there's been this ongoing trend in notebooks for probably 10 years now in terms of creating incredibly thin and light notebooks. So how does ForcePad, first of all, from an industrial design standpoint, play into that, and why could that possibly be a benefit in that category?
Yeah. Question. There's kind of two trends, and you mentioned the first one, right? Everybody's trying to get thinner laptops and really trying to get that edge on the industrial design, and that's also meeting a second trend, which is growing to a surface for your right. And so we've seen people want to have a very large area to interact, do gestures, take advantage of that full real estate. And so when that happens, you're in a traditional ClickPad, there's a mechanical movement that goes up and down, and that movement scales basically linearly with the size of the touchpad. And so as your touchpad gets 2 or 3 times larger than it was, say, 5 years ago, it's taking a bigger bite out of the space that's underneath the touchpad to have clearance for that. And so that creates a problem, right? Because as you get thinner, you're trying to squeeze battery underneath there in many cases. And so you start compressing on that area. And so force gives you the ability to address both of those trends. Force, it does not, there's no physical movement that you have to design around. And so it allows you to go very thin, but also as you scale out to a very large surface, you still keep that same level of thinness. It doesn't grow in terms of how much space it requires underneath the touch surface in order. And so those two together, really, it's a perfect solution for that, to be able to come in and make sure that you can get as thin as you want with the design, but still go very large with your clicking surface. And so that's I think timing-wise, that's why it's making sense right now. It's both of those things coming together.
Yeah, and so let's dive into a little bit deeper. And Tyson, because you're probably the technology expert for Steve, because Steve doesn't know too much about technology. I know him personally, and he runs at a very, very high level. But all kidding aside, let's talk about the mechanical mechanism in a traditional touchpad, like a ClickPad, which ClickPads are pretty traditional. You don't see a lot of notebooks anymore with physical buttons. Most I'm probably close to 100% of the notebooks on the market today are some type of ClickPad, what we used to call ClickPad design. Let's describe, though, that mechanical mechanism, because that does have a pretty significant impact on the Z height of the notebook. Could you explain that to the audience?
Sure. So as you described, most touch solutions in a PC are ClickPads. So you have this dome switch behind the touch sensor, and you have this mechanical assembly that moves the ClickPad physically up and down, sort of like a hinge door, right? So if you look at the trend of PCs today, that ClickPad size is increasing year over year. If you look at some solutions out there, about a 160 by 100 millimeter, and they're just getting bigger. So if you look at the example of the door I just gave you, as the door gets bigger, the swing of the door becomes harder to do, right? So these ClickPads, as they get bigger, they have to be rigid, so the performance is there, but then you have to increase the thickness of that whole stack up. Now, what the ForcePad enables you to do is increase that size with less impact to the Z height, because it's not moving up and down physically. it's a static solution. So you're able to that's one of the reasons why these PC OEMs are interested in Force.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about the thinness, and obviously the capability facilitates thinner designs. When you go into and you peel that back a bit and you talk about some of the usage models that may enable, because it really presents some interesting opportunities. So Steve, from your perspective, at a very high level, because a lot of this is still kind of up in the air, and you've got companies like Apple and Microsoft and others that probably play a pretty significant role in determining what those usage models are. But from a Synaptics perspective, let's talk a little bit about the potential high-level usage models that might enable.
Sure. Yeah, I think what we look at first and foremost is it needs to provide a great experience just in place of the click pad itself, right? And so we don't want to take away something that users are familiar with and have them need to be kind of trained up on something that's different. And so that's kind of our first guiding principle, right? Is it needs to be an excellent replacement for the click pad. And so one of the things that's super important about that is having a response, so that the user knows, hey, I pressed down on this and I felt a click come back, right? Even though it's not the same type click that's done before, but we add haptics into that so that there's a response, so that it's an affirmative back into the user that, okay, yes, it's been clicked like that, right? So that's kind of the first most important thing, is just making sure this is a great experience. But there's definitely other things that could be added, right? So we think about things such as having different levels of granularity in your control, right? So you'd be able to have pressure detected, right? And our different solutions that can detect pressure by individual fingers or detect pressure just overall on the pad. And we found a lot more common interest right now because it's something that you can build on. For example, the first is to show that you're actually I'm looking at this, I have some intention possibly, and then you can have a harder push, which means, hey, I want to confirm this and go forward with that. So I think there's things that from a user experience, and as you said, these are things that will require OS partners and OEMs and ourselves, really to think through what can be these new usage models, to enable for the customer. And then, there's other things that are actually, things that could just be done very simply, and we've seen OEMs do this. So, for example, recent launches of a full force pad under a full plastic cover, and so in that case, it's completely sealed. There's no moving parts. There's no areas for dust, water, any of those types of things. And so you've been able to, take a product that you can get some thinness out of it, but you could also get, maximum kind of waterproofing, right? And just environmental conditions. So that's been another area where force has been applied that, 2 or 3 years ago, we hadn't thought of as a mainstream usage, right? But this is an area where you can do that. So I think that's going to be interesting. And even outside the PCs, I think you'll see things, that are we're operating in environments where you want to have these sealed off. And so I think force has some very interesting usages, throughout the industry.
Now, one area we should talk about, because it's an important, especially when you're talking about notebooks, and we should talk about other product categories as well. But with respect to notebooks or laptops, there is this topic of the Microsoft Precision Touchpad initiative, which Microsoft kicked off several years ago, and they kind of dipped their toe in the waters with their Surface products. And that was, to me, kind of an attempt by Microsoft to try to create some level of consistency and standard with the touchpad experience. Now, the interesting thing is that Synaptics for years, of course, has been providing their own driver. At a high level, when I look at what Microsoft does from a precision touchpad standpoint versus what Synaptics does, there's a lot more functionality typically in the Synaptics driver than there is in the Microsoft driver. But let's talk a little bit about in terms of the way you kind of comprehend that in your go-to-market activities. Because obviously when you're working with your partners and you've got guys who've got significant market, you've always had very significant market share in the laptop space, you have to do it in a kind of agnostic type of way. We want to support this, we'll support this as well. So, Tyson, from your perspective, because you talk to a lot of the OEMs, what is the kind of the way that Synaptics comprehends that whole PTP initiative into their go-to-market plans regarding not just ForcePad, but everything that you guys do?
Yeah, so I think what you said about Precision Touchpad is pretty much correct. Microsoft's attempt when they launched that was to keep the experience consistent, no matter if you're using an HP machine, a Lenovo machine, or a Dell machine, no matter which touch supplier was providing the hardware. So the biggest thing that Precision Touchpad brought to the table was that consistency, as well as to me, was the scrolling experience. So what they leverage is what they call the touch injection for scrolling. So you basically get the touch feeling on a touchpad you would get from a touch screen. Mm-hmm. So the resolution of the scrolling was much smoother than the traditional touchpad driver was providing, because what the driver was providing for the touchpad suppliers was scroll wheel packets. So you would get, if you remember the traditional mouse scroll wheel, right? It is a mechanical wheel that would rotate, and you would get these notches that would scroll. And that's pretty much what you were getting from the touchpad driver. And what PTP changed was the resolution of that scrolling was much more smoother. Users appreciated that much more with the PTP driver.
So let's take it up a notch here too, because what I like to tell people, that hey, when I worked for Synaptics and I was overseeing the business that provided touchpads and notebooks, I think a lot of mainstream consumers think that touchpads are a very simple technology, and they're actually very, very complex. I mean, it's an accolade to Synaptics. I think that the fact is the technology has become so mainstream over the years that people tend to see it in a very non-complex way, but it's actually a fairly complex capability. And you're not just supplying a component, to an ODM that then puts that product into an OEM solution like an HP or a Dell. What's always fascinating about Synaptics is the value proposition it has around usability. Steve, you talked about that before. The human interface interaction, the customer experience, that's the operative phrase here. You're not just providing a piece of silicon or a piece of metal that goes into the palm rest of a notebook and you're off to the races. I mean, the people use that part of the notebook on a very regular basis, and it really has to become second nature. So let's talk about the Synaptics value proposition in terms of the way that technology is deployed. And the fact that it's a module. I mean, you just don't supply a chip. You're supplying the mechanical in most cases, the touchpad itself, the driver in many cases. There's a QA component to this. So let's talk about that, because I think that requires a bit of explanation to validate the value proposition that Synaptics provides.
Yeah, Mark, that's a great point, right? So when we look at how do we provide an end-to-end solution, all of those are key components, right? So it's starting with what experience is trying to enable for their customers, right? And so some of them are looking for a very standardized experience, and other ones have a feel for their particular brand. And so we work with the customers very closely with their user experience teams, industrial design, engineering, marketing teams, to really come up with what's the right solution for their product. And then typically, that involves kind of the whole stack, right? So we start with, our ASICs certainly enable this, but we tend to build the whole module, because when you look at the customer's experience, things such as very robust and crisp click is very. And so one of the things we've done is not only building the ASIC and the full PCBA assembly, but also building mechanical structures, so we can get really solution in there every time consistently across all their platforms. And so a number of customers go all the way through the mechanical solutions with us. And in terms of drivers, that's an area where our service levels are very fast, and we can provide some differentiation there. So some customers will go that route. Others are more than happy to go down the route of just kind of the standardized industry experience. So we're happy to work with either one of those. And those from touchpads into click pads all the way through force pads, right? It's really an ability for us to understand the customer's problem and really share with our main customers how do end users think about this, right? So we have a fully staffed usability team that goes out and especially when we're class of product understands okay, how do people think about this? What's the intuitive way to do this? Because you really don't want to have to train people in this, right? That's one thing we've learned over the years is that when you have to train someone or teach someone, then you're fighting an uphill battle. And so as we think about how do we get into intuitive or even the term perceptive computing, right, where we think the PC understands what someone's trying to accomplish without us having to train them. That's really the key thing. And so as we looked at Force, for example, we've come back and kind of realized that making this great experience for what kind of the interactivity that users are already used to is going to be first and foremost, and then we can build on top of that and add other things to it once we've got the baseline right.
In the few minutes we have left, I think it's important to point out that there have been some forced designs that Synaptics has kind of roped in. So it's not like it's this is coming. I mean, certainly more notebooks and laptops in the future and other types of products will be coming down the pipeline, and hopefully in the not too distant future they'll have that capability. But Tyson, let's talk about there's been some impressive design wins that Synaptics has had with Force. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we developed ForcePad in the 2011 timeframe. So when I was still in Japan, our first product launched with HP. They actually launched their Force solution in 2012, well before Apple released their solution. And they basically did Force for most of their commercial PCs. And then recently we have did other Force solutions, other different kinds of Force technologies. We were in the Intel reference PC, and that was in 2015 with the Skylake reference design. And then last year we were working with Lenovo, what Steve was just talking about, on a solution that was quite unique in the market. So basically what that solution was that there was no seam for the touchpad in the palm rest. So usually there's in the PC palm rest, you have this hole and then the touchpad is inserted in that hole and you physically see the touchpad, right? So what Lenovo decided to do was have a more sleek design where the touchpad was actually, or the force pad in this case, was hidden in the palm rest. So the palm rest was completely smooth, there was no seam, and they just mounted the force pad from below, and that was the idea that they were going for. So that was the most recent force pad design that we have. But to your point, Force is trending in the PC, the OEMs, and I expect Force solutions, Force designs in the PC market to be growing.
And we shouldn't confine, Steve, our conversation toward just the laptop space. Force is going to show up in other product categories that Synaptics serves. So can we talk about a couple of those?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the value proposition of Force, right, it gives you, in the PC, it's giving you a thinness, right, and that's I think showing some immediate fruition in terms of solving that problem of larger pads and notebooks. But if you think about the usage model itself, it could apply in all sorts of different devices, right? And so you think about the ability to press something, understand, be able to detect, okay, this is what I'm pressing, and then press harder maybe to click it. So I could see areas such as automotive that could be pretty interesting, right? Where you may not, you got your eyes on the road and you press, and today it can be so you have to kind of be able to see where that is, press, get some sort of initial feedback, and then press harder to confirm that. So I think there's a number. The other area that we've seen just in general in the marketplace is potentially interest is in white goods, right? So things that are needing to be, again, like sealed surfaces, those kind of things, those can be fairly interesting. So there's I think a wide variety, outside of just the core markets that Synaptics focuses on today, where Force could be a pretty interesting solution.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting next couple of years for Synaptics, specific to this product category, because I just think that the Force can really have a dramatic impact, not just on laptops and the thinner designs, but other form factors. I easily could see a lot of places where Force could show up in an automobile, somewhere in the dashboard. God knows that area needs as much innovation as it possibly can, because I think people are tired with wheels, and even sometimes touchscreens are not the most convenient capabilities to use inside a car. But this has really been fascinating. We have to really revisit this. Tyson, I'm going to tee this up for you. Where do we find Synaptics? How do we get? What's the name of the website?
I'm sorry.
The name of your website. I hope you know the answer to that.
Oh, www.synaptics.com.
Right. Well, this has been terrific, Steve. Tyson, thank you for joining today's podcast. Thank you to the entire Moor Insights and Strategy audience for following and listening to us. Please follow us on our social media partners. That's Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And until next time, have a great July 4th weekend.